some purposeful confusion based, sometimes. But the FSA honestly has very little unity, and they don't really have a unified vision beyond toppling the regime. And so there's no top-down. So even though there is a chief of staff of the FSA, he has very little control beyond the people who want to really listen to him. Otherwise, other battalions kind of do as they please. And most FSA groups at this point are just struggling locally to fight either regime forces or ISIS now forces. And they, on the political kind of ideological scale, are very varied too. Some groups are definitely Islamist, for lack of a better word, and I don't want to say Islamist as in extremist, because I think a lot of times we confuse it, but Islamist as in they look to Islam to kind of, and the principles of Islam as their guiding principles. There are secular groups that fight under the umbrella of the FSA. There are also groups who have engaged in sectarian violence, and those that have ties to Al-Qaeda, who obviously need to be condemned by other Syrian opposition groups. But I think a problem, again, we tend to paint all of these FSA as one thing, whether they are extremists, Islamists, Al-Qaeda, and I personally find most disturbing and most problematic Western-backed rebels, which I think is just not true. There are rebels and people and fighters who have received weapons from the U.S. or its ally, some who have received training, but honestly, they're negligible when you're fighting a regime that has tanks and that has missiles. Like, I don't really know what you're going to do with some guns against those forces. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's been the point of U.S. policy, is you give enough support to Syrian groups fighting the regime to keep the regime busy, trying to put down the revolution, but not enough to actually let them topple the regime. And we can also discuss what that means for U.S. policy, but it's just that's kind of let them kill each other. As Daniel Pipes has said, very optimistically, he's like, yeah, let them just kill each other. But it's not only some crazy man like Daniel Pipes has said that. General Martin Dempsey said the same exact thing last year. Again, when the discussions of whether the U.S. was actually going to bomb or not, he was very clear. It's not U.S. interest to actually go in and get involved. And so where does Daesh come into this in the forms of the U.S.? As Phyllis mentioned, I'm not going to talk, but their roots are in Iraq. They're not in Syria, so that's very important to tag. Their rise, honestly, is due to the opportunity presented by chaos created. And this chaos is created because, to me, there's been an incompetent response from the international community to what's been happening in Syria and to the increasing violence in Iraq post-occupation, or U.S. really never left. And so that's kind of where their rise is. It's not, when I deal with some folks, it's like, well, it's a U.S. conspiracy and that's where it came from. It's like, no, this is reality. Like when you're in a position when there's so much desperation, that's where these extremist groups come in, because people are just looking for an answer, and here's an easy answer. And like Phyllis said, they're governing areas now, so they have money. We can also discussion where they get their funding from. It's not very clear, but they do now control oil fields in Syria. There's a lot of evidence that they get a lot of funding from individuals in the Gulf states. But yeah. So, and one thing I do want to stress too, I think a lot of what I've seen very problematic in the way people discuss ISIS and in general the Syrian rebel groups, it's like, yeah, they're all the same. Just put everything in one umbrella. And that's very problematic. I mean, the groups that have been at the forefront of fighting ISIS in Syria are FSA groups. That's the reality. And so we need to think about that versus kind of, oh, well, we're sending weapons to moderate, and they say moderate in a very mocking way, as if there's no Syrian groups that are truly fighting for freedom. Everyone is just some pawn, and then they end up in the hands of ISIS. And that's, again, not ignoring all the details and the complications that are actually going on in Syria, and just wanting to paint everything like this is what happened, and this is the I understand it to extent that we want to build up opposition to U.S. policy and the bombing, so you have to somewhat simplify things. But when you simplify to the point where you're making things up, that doesn't also help either. And so my last couple points, to me, Daesh and ISIS is one of the many, is just part of a much larger problem. This larger problem, and many problems actually, they range from the ability of their Syrian regime to remain in power and continue its campaign of terror, to a U.S. foreign policy that continues to be dominated by a commitment to Israel, a commitment to selling weapons and making money, and of course buying oil. So what do we do out of this? Where are the answers? And I really have no answers, but some things that we need to do, what we can ponder when we get to the next open Q&A and think about answers. I think the first thing we need to think about is making sure there is a discussion that forces people to think about when the United States chooses to intervene in things. And so when we look at Syria, the Syrian regime has killed anywhere between 100 to 125,000 people, a number far, far greater than those killed by ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. And again, when we think about the victims of ISIS, yes, it was horrific that those journalists were killed. And it was horrific that, for example, in Mosul, the Christians were ethnically cleansed this past summer, but the vast majority of the victims have been Muslim, and yet no one kind of cared. It was only, again, when we saw white men being beheaded that we were like, oh my God, this group is horrible. The second thing we need to think about is how the United States intervened. The Syrian regime survives at this point because of Russian and Iranian supports, and this support needs to end. But for an international community that continues to say, oh no, we need to do what we can to end this war, there's really very little being done, unfortunately, to change the political calculus of these two countries and why they are supporting Assad. And so just earlier this year, the Winter Olympics went on in Russia as if nothing was happening. Okay, whatever, let's all go to Russia, enjoy the Olympics, and it was interesting because at that time there was talks about boycotting because of the Russian policies, being discriminatory against gays and lesbians, but no one ever brought up, oh, maybe we should not go because they're supporting, Assad. That didn't come up as all. We have so much drama around Iran's fake nuclear weapons, and no discussion about how do we use negotiations with Iran to actually kind of bring Syria into the picture. Of course, it's the United States lecturing any of these countries on supporting human rights violation is laughable. We know what the U.S. actually supports. They support regimes in Bahrain, they support regimes in Israel and in Egypt, and they, of course, commit their own war crimes. And I personally think the U.S. is currently coordinating with the Syrian regime on what's going on. I don't see how they can be guaranteed that their planes will not be bombed by the regime without having some sort of discussion with the regime. And Syrian regime media has been very open. They're like, I think probably exaggerating the coordination, but been like, yeah, the U.S. and Syria are coordinating hand in hand, fighting this war on terror. Very hilarious for a regime that claims to be anti-imperialist. And so the incompetence and corruption of the international community is on full display in Syria. And the Syrian people are just the victims at this point. The third point is, yes, we need to continue to fight against the airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. Already civilians have been killed. Not surprising, the U.S. said, oh, we are actually, these strikes are exempt from the tight standards we use for drone strikes. We know how tight those standards are, so I mean, it's laughable. But we also cannot go from just ending the strikes to doing nothing. That cannot be the choice. 200,000 Syrians have been killed. That's just in the past month. Hundreds have been killed by the regime's barrel bombing in Aleppo. Tens of thousands of Syrian refugees continue to stream out of the country every single month. Countless more have been disappeared, have been tortured, have been raped. I think Palestinians in Syria get even less attention, but we think about Palestinians in the Yarmouk camp who've been under siege now by the regime by over a year. How many of us actually knew this? Haven't had water now for 2 months into the camp. And so we need to think, it can't just be like, we stopped the war, we stopped the U.S. strikes, excellent. There needs to be more because this is a humanitarian disaster that's going to affect the entire region and eventually spill over more further. And finally, I do want to end on somewhat of a positive note because the news covers death and destruction. And this positive note comes from Syria itself, where Syrians, despite everything that's going on, continue to come out and protest in any way they can. Whatever, even the smallest act of protest is still an act of protest. And they're protesting not only against the regime, they're protesting against ISIS, they're protesting against any group that is not following the principles of freedom, justice, and dignity for which this uprising began. And so we owe it to them to at least acknowledge their struggle when we're talking about the U.S. and its role, and to think about what the Syrian people are actually doing and going through. And just last December, so almost a year ago, a banner was raised in the city of Kafr in December of 2013 that summarized the situation, I think, very well. The enemies are many, the revolution is one, and continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. That was a lot of different points. I just want to ask a few questions, let you all simmer and come up with your own questions. We'll open it up in a minute. I guess just to start with kind of zeroing in, you both set a very large context, so zeroing in on the last few months when the U.S. has been actively militarily engaged in a much more substantive way than they have in years past. And what has the impact of this military intervention just in the last few months been in this region?
Well, I think to start with the impact in the region, first, it's killing people. You know, the notion that you can bomb extremism is one of those impossibilities that people like to talk about without really thinking what it means. You can't bomb extremism. You bomb cities. You bomb people. You kill people. So that's one thing that's going on. Some of the people that are being killed may well be from ISIS, probably some of them. Clearly, some of them are not. There have been children killed, there have been civilians killed directly by the U.S. bombing. So that's one aspect. The other is the political side of what's the impact. And here's where it gets much harder, because if you look, it's somewhat easier to see in Syria, in Iraq. I think similar things will emerge in Syria, perhaps a bit later, but in Iraq it's already this way, that the reality of ISIS support, the reason that it's so powerful, is not only that it has a lot of money. It has a lot of money because it's had a lot of people, it gets a lot of support. Why has it been able to accomplish so much? Why has it been able to take and hold territory and govern cities when it's not a huge group? I mean, they now say it might be as many as 30,000 fighters. But that's over the last couple of years. They started much smaller than that. So how did that happen? Well, one way is that in Iraq, the conditions for ordinary Iraqi Sunnis was so bad, given the repression of the Syrian regime, I keep saying Syrian, the Iraqi regime, backed by the United States, this sectarian, Shia-based regime. Sectarianism had become toxic in the country. It had become incredibly powerful. And one impact of that was that for some groups of Sunnis, obviously not all, but for particularly Sunni former military officers, including a lot of generals, who had been generals under Saddam Hussein's regime, when the US occupation began, the first thing that happened, you all remembered, was the dismantling of the army. People were fired, lost their jobs, and sent home, many of them with their weapons. It's really a smart thing to do, right? You have 300,000 people under arms, and you dismantle the army and send them home with no job, very, very angry. That's really sensible, right? So that's a lot of these people. So what happens? They're looking for a way to take up arms. Here comes ISIS, looking like a pretty powerful group, a Sunni group, an anti-Shia group, an anti-Iraqi government group. What's not to like? So they begin to provide military training, strategy, etc. Some of the Sunni tribal leaders who have their own militias in Iraq, they also ally themselves with ISIS, not because they are extremists, not because they are violent, not because they are misogynist, despite the fact that they are all those things. Keeping in mind that most of the Sunni leadership in Iraq are very secular. You know, these guys, they drink, they smoke, they're modern, they're not trying to go back to the 7th century like ISIS is, but they saw no option, because this was not just about losing their privileges. Yeah, they had privileges under Saddam Hussein's regime. It wasn't just about losing privileges. It was about mass roundups, young people being arrested by the hundreds, people being killed, people being tortured in prisons by Shia militias and by the Iraqi government, backed by the United States. And it had gotten so bad in recent years that ISIS was looking like a pretty good way to fight back. So they gained enormous support. So in the context of the US airstrikes, what gets portrayed here as, oh look, we got the bad guys, yay, we're going after the bad guys, is seen in Iraq as, here's the US bombing in the interests of the Kurds and the Shia against the Sunni. So everything that President Obama and others say about, we can't only use military, we also have to persuade the Sunni leadership to give up ISIS. Yeah, well, that's a good idea. And every time you drop a bomb, it undermines the possibility of that happening. So all of those nice words were completely undermined by the military action. So that's, when we look at the impact of the bombing, that's the political side, alongside the starting point, which is that in both Syria and Iraq, it's killing more people. You know, and it's, in the case of Syria, the political impact is to strengthen the regime. So in both cases, it's undermining exactly what the opposite is of what the US says they want to do.
Yeah, I'm just gonna give one example from Syria. It's true, so we've now 6 weeks into our strikes in Syria. We've struck ISIS, we've struck, ISIS targets, we've struck Jabhat al-Nusra targets, which is in Idlib. So ISIS is in the northeast part of the country mostly, is the areas they control. Idlib is in the northwest part of the country, under control of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliated group. And actually those strikes pissed off a lot of the opposition groups, fighting opposition groups that the US is supposedly trying to build relationships with, because it's like, I don't understand why you guys are bombing these groups that are fighting the regime. You all, there's a lot of anger on the ground, honestly, against the United States from fighting groups who just honestly, like, you are now freeing up the regime to just go all in against the opposition groups, because whatever, the US is taking care of ISIS for them, and now they can concentrate heavily on finishing off the revolution, which they've been trying, which they've taken advantage of. Again, there's been increasing amounts of barrel bombs in Aleppo, increasing amounts of missiles, and so that's extremely problematic, because you're just prolonging the life of this regime that needs to honestly go at this point. But in one of their strikes against ISIS early on, I think this was within the first 2 weeks, they hit in Deir ez-Zor, I forget which was the specific city, but Deir ez-Zor, again, the northwest part of the country, these wheat silos, wheat that was feeding millions of Syrians. They hit the wheat silos and they killed the workers there. Very interesting. Syrian people, there's a hunger issue in Syria, not enough food, so now you're starving Syrians in order to free them, I guess. But there's very interesting story against these wheat silos. When ISIS came particularly and took over this particular city, I believe in January of this year, the workers had refused to let ISIS take control of these wheat silos. They were like, we are not working under you. And so they let them they want that. They were able to keep control. And they had done this too also previously when other, again, FSA-related groups had come and tried to take over the wheat silos, and the workers said, no, we want to keep control because we want to make sure that that everyone is being able to be fed. And once a fighting group takes over, they can use kind of that as leverage of who gets to eat, who doesn't, you have to pledge allegiance to us, etc., etc. So it's very disturbing that for so long they were able to keep their strength and not let ISIS take over these silos that then they can use for political leverage amongst other groups. Like, if you come and support us, we'll feed you. If you don't, we won't feed you. And it was the US that came and destroyed them and killed the workers. And so there's anyone who thinks at all that the US has any interest in the Syrian people, the Syrian revolution, it's not at all true. And this latest, the way we decided to kind of get more involved is, I think, all the proof you need.
So we talked a lot about that there's this pressure to bomb, or we're going to let people get away with it, whatever it is. So can you talk a bit about alternatives to military intervention? What are other solutions? And then also, what should we, as a US-based anti-war movement, do and be doing? And I know some of you kind of touched on some of those, but just to add to that area.
Yeah, so I'll again focus on Syria. We know who's keeping the Syrian regime in power. It's Russia and it's Iran. And until they are brought into any sort of discussion about what needs to happen in Syria, this is going to continue going on. And there is leverage. I mean, we saw how the U.S. reacted over Ukraine, and kind of, and I'm not at all an expert about Ukraine, so I'm not gonna. But there was reaction from the regime, from Syria, from the U.S. regime. You know, good, bad. I do not know enough to judge, but it was just interesting how quickly there was a reaction versus kind of in Syria. There's been a lot of dragging feet, and I think. Again, looking at the whole entire region, it's funny that the U.S. would be the one calling for people to respect human rights in the region when they don't respect any human rights. But it's a reality that we have to somewhat figure out what we can do then and act with. So at one point it was pointed out the Pentagon was buying helicopters from the same exact Russian company that was providing weapons to the regime. And those helicopters being used in our war in Afghanistan. So very convoluted and very problematic, but look, there's something that potentially, and there was a discussion in the Senate, like, how dare we buy these weapons, and from the Russians, they're so evil, we need to find somewhere else to buy our weapons, and etc. So those kinds of things. Again, things like the Olympics, like, to me, those are potentials. I think Iran, the problem with Iran is that the United States is not interested. The United States has for several years, their goal with Iran is, Iran's, and it's the same as it's Israeli goal, like Iran is creating nuclear weapons, we need to stop this, etc., etc. And so there was no space whatsoever to expand the conversation from these nuclear negotiations to actually involve Iran. And Iran actually brought this up back when Hillary Clinton was still Secretary of State. There was an attempt by the Iranians to be like, listen, we'll do nuclear negotiation, we want to include Syria in this as well. And the US refused. And so, again, when we're talking about doing nothing, there's a lot of space in there, and I think potentially a lot more research that can be done. I think part of it falls on the US not wanting to do all of it, it's part of it. Part of it falls on the Syrian political opposition groups. They have failed, to say it nicely, to accomplish a lot of what they set out. Some of them set out from the beginning, we want US intervention. Some of them were trying to figure out other ways to kind of get US support that was not openly, like boots on the ground, maybe just some weapons, more sophisticated weapons and training for the rebel groups. But it's all failed. And I think, again, the primary reason it failed is this assumption that the US wanted the regime to change. I don't think the US ever wanted the regime to change. I still don't think the US wants the regime to change. Maybe if they find someone who can be their puppet in Syria, they might then switch their mind, but they haven't located that yet. And so why would they change the calculus until they are guaranteed that whoever comes after is that? So figuring out how to get Russia and Iran to cut ties with the regime is, I think, one wrong thing. The other thing, and I think this is humanitarian aid. I know it's not a solution and is not, but there's a disaster happening, and we need to ensure that humanitarian aid is continued. I mean, the World Food, in Lebanon, for example, recently I heard the World Food Program is having to cut back on their rations there. 25% of the Lebanese population at this moment is Syrian refugees and continuing to grow every single day. So to them to be like, oh no, we need to now cut our aid to them is bad, and we need to figure out how do we push that more and more countries can actually not only commit but come through. All these Friends of Syria, please, like Friends of Syria for what? Syrian people, it's winter time now, it's going to be winter soon, the refugee camps are overflowing. In Jordan, you now have large refugee camps that are as big as Jordanian cities and even bigger. So we have to figure out a way to deal with this, because this is going to be another long-term refugee problem. We already have one long-term refugee problem in this region, the Palestinian refugees. This is shaping up to be a second very long-term refugee problem, and we can't let it. We've seen what Palestinian refugees have gone through. we can't let a whole other group of people go through what they've gone through.
Thanks, Rama. I agree that the question of the Russian and Iranian role is crucial. I differ from Rama somewhat in how that might come about. Before I get into that, though, I think it is important. There's a group of Syrian women, I was just looking to see if, I don't have it with me, the name of the organization in Syria, who have recently come forward with a proposal, I don't know if you've seen it, that it's basically a three-part proposal that starts with a vast increase of humanitarian aid for all the reasons that Rama just said so powerfully. The UN cut, by the way, is 40% of the food rations. It's a huge cut for a very vulnerable population. The second is to focus on local ceasefires. This is similar to the call that emerged just in the last 2 days from the UN special envoy to Syria. He's been in the region meeting with opposition folks, local protesters, the regime, meeting with everybody, and has emerged with a call for the expansion of local ceasefires, which have been emerging in several places. The call right now is for some version of that to happen in Aleppo. Whether that's possible isn't yet clear, but there's some indication that that might work. Local ceasefires are not an answer. They're not an end to the war, but they allow humanitarian corridors to be created to allow food in to areas, in some cases, that have been surrounded and cut off from food and water and electricity for months. And in other places, they have expanded so that it may be that they could be expanded to a wider spread ceasefire. And the third part in this, in the women's proposal, was for new negotiations. And that's where I think we have to look at the question of the role of Syria and vis-a-vis Iran and Russia. The only way, I think, that there's any chance of Iran and Russia responding to any kind of U.S. pressure is not going to be from buying helicopters in a different place or even boycotts of things like the Olympics. It's going to be on the basis of the U.S. getting some kind of credibility for raising it, which means they are going to cut off their own clients in the region, which means no more U.S. arms to the opposition forces that have been going through Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey and Jordan. Those are all U.S. weapons. Well, there's a few from France, but they're mainly U.S. weapons that those countries have been buying from the U.S. There's an enormous level of pressure that has to happen there, which is not going to be easy because it may be that those regimes are prepared to say, and these are cruel and nationalistic regimes that have no interest in the Syrian people either, but they are looking for clients in the region and they are arming what they see as their clients in the region. And the result is that they are having a huge impact in fomenting further militarization. If the U.S. demands that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey stop providing arms to the opposition, if there is resistance, the only way it will work is if the U.S. says, if you don't, we're not going to sell you any more arms. And imagine what that means given the power of the military producers' lobby here in Washington. Not an easy thing. But without that, I don't think there's any way that the U.S. is going to be in any position to push Russia and Iran to engage in a different way. I think there is a possibility in the new nuclear talks with Iran that there may be a chance. I think this is the one arena where Obama has a chance at a legacy. He's pretty much blown every other foreign policy opportunity. And legacy is what's on his agenda for the next 2 years. So I think that he may be looking at really trying hard in the nuclear talks. And if he can figure out a way to deal with the Israelis and their supporters in Congress to allow it to go forward, it could be expanded to include not only Syria, but a broader U.S.-Iran rapprochement, what they call the grand bargain that was hoped for right after September 11, when Iran and the U.S. were actually talking for the first time since the Iranian Revolution. And then George Bush destroyed that by suddenly deciding that Iran was part of the axis of evil instead. So it's a very complicated set of international diplomatic moves. There's going to have to be a move by the UN. Again, it's failed twice. Special envoys have failed twice to get the broader negotiations underway. But I think one of the aspects of that is, one of the reasons it failed was because the US insisted that Iran not be at the table. And of course that flies in the face of diplomacy. If you want real diplomacy, everybody has to be at the table, not because you agree with them, but precisely because you don't. And if they're not at the table, number one, they're not accountable to anything you decide, and they can violate it with impunity. Number two, more importantly, the people who support them are not going to feel connected, so there's no buy-in from half the population. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, what this probably means is that the talks are not going to be able to be based on getting rid of the regime as a starting point. It's going to be a negotiated arrangement. I think that is a reality to stop this war. That doesn't take into account